And welcome to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville. So glad you're joining us today. For the next half hour or so, we'll be talking about some good things going on at the University of Louisville, research, students, programming, all sorts of stuff. So we hope you'll stick around for the next half hour or so for UofL Today with Mark Hebert. So coming up in the second half of the show, the fourth woman to be nominated and sworn into a seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. She's a justice, and she's coming to the University of Louisville. See if you can figure out who that is by the time the interim dean of the law school, Susan Duncan, comes on the show to tell us about that event, the new class of law school students, and the community service work they're doing here in Louisville. But first, they are professors and researchers in the UofL College of Education and Human Development who are doing groundbreaking research on teacher interactions with difficult students. And they say they have the largest database in the world on teacher-student interactions. So if you're a big fan of tough discipline, you might find some of Terry Scott's research conclusions hard to believe. He's here now to talk about his classroom research with Regina Hirn, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Special Education, and Terry is also a professor in the College of Education and Human Development. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so Terry, you've been on the program before. Why don't you kind of give a summary for those of us who are folks who are listening who don't know what your research is about. What are you doing in terms of research on interactions between students and teachers, and particularly those students who are tough to deal with perhaps in the classroom?
Well, we looked at the research, everything that was available in the entire world. What are the things that give you the best chance of having kids be successful? And what we found is those things that make kids successful work as well for kids with challenging behaviors. So it's not a separate set of things. It's even more important that we use effective instruction. So we then went out and started looking at classrooms. We've now been in over 7,000 of those classrooms. Excuse me. And what we're asking is, are teachers using those instructional behaviors that we know are most effective? And when they do or don't, how does that affect what kids do? So in a nutshell, we've got a huge database that we can analyze to say, what does the average teacher do? What does the average kid do? And how does what the average teacher does affect what the average kid does?
And how does it?
Well, what we find is, first and foremost, teachers use very, very small amounts of these things. And we're talking about things like teachers talking to kids, asking kids questions, getting kids engaged, teachers giving simple feedback to kids, yes, no, that's right, that's wrong. We find that those things happen at incredibly low rates. And we also find that the lower those rates are, the more off-task and disruptive the kids are.
Wow, and that's a little bit of an indictment of either teacher education or teachers in general, or the system that they have 30 kids in their class and they don't have the time to take with individual
I think all
kids.
of the above.
All right. Well, Regina, you teach special education, correct? Or you teach teachers who want to be special ed teachers, correct?
Yes.
So how do you fit into this study that Terry's been working on?
Well, one piece that I would add is we take those effective teacher practices and we embed those in our coursework. And we encourage our teachers to implement those in the classrooms as they're doing their practicums, as they're doing their student teaching, to really embed those practices as a skill set so that we are more likely to see those in the classroom setting.
So the new teachers that are coming out of UofL should have some tools to deal with kids who can be disruptive.
Absolutely.
And in special education, do we find that the kids that are what we call special education kids, are they more disruptive and more likely to disrupt a classroom than the average kid?
We do find that.
Special ed, no. Kids in special ed for behavior problems.
For behavior problems, yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Well, that's a different
That is, yes.
category then.
Absolutely.
Are kids being placed in those classes in the special ed category if they're disruptive, even though they're not considered, quote, special ed, what we would consider special ed?
The large majority of kids who are in special ed are not in a special class. They're fully included with all the other kids. Even kids with the most challenging behaviors, by and large, are in the typical classroom. So what we've looked at, and this has really been a big part of Regina's work, is do teachers treat those kids differently? Do teachers engage those kids more often, which is what we'd want to see, and provide more feedback? But, and Regina can talk about it, no, they don't.
Okay.
And what we actually found is we looked at the interactions between teachers and adolescents that had behavior problems in the classroom, just exhibiting behavior difficulties in the classroom. We actually found that teachers interact with them less than they do with other students in the classroom. And we're not exactly sure why that is. We have some ideas that, maybe it's best not to ask them a question. You're not sure what's going to prompt that next response from them. But we find that if they do give them feedback, they give them negative feedback, and they are very unlikely to ask them questions about the curriculum or engage them in the specific activities.
We're talking with Regina Hirn and Terry Scott from the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Louisville, and we're talking about their study and their database of all these interactions between teachers and kids in classroom. Terry, there was something that you passed along to me that I thought was really interesting, and you mentioned it earlier. You said, across grades, we find that teachers use extremely low rates of the instructional behaviors that we know provide the highest probability for student success. So teachers just aren't using the tools that they should know or were given to them. Is that a problem in every school, or are there some schools that are doing a great job of getting teachers that are interacting with kids one-on-one and doing a better job of engaging them and keeping them out of these disruptive behaviors?
Certainly, when I'm saying we do a poor job of it, I'm talking about on the average, and there is variation. However, even that variation is from 0 to fairly low, but small differences in observation accrue over time. So, for instance, we looked at all of our what we call Title I or high poverty schools. And we went in and we assessed every teacher in these schools. And we looked at the difference between high poverty schools that are really high achieving and high poverty schools that are very low achieving. The only difference in those two kinds of schools, high achieving and low achieving, all high poverty, is the degree to which the teachers engage the kids during instruction. So the average kid in a high poverty school that's high achieving gets more than 260 additional chances to respond to instruction every week. And there's the difference. So you might say per minute, the difference is very little. But when you take that per minute and accrue it over the week, the month, the year, those kids get a lot more instruction.
So kids who come from low-income backgrounds in poor school districts can succeed if their teachers are engaging them one-on-one more in the classroom. Is that essentially what you're trying to tell me, or
That's what we're really trying to understand better. What are those key teacher behaviors that we can encourage in the classroom setting that are going to give students the best opportunity to be successful? And one of those that we found in this difference between the two groups is that the teachers in the high-performing schools where students were being successful really are giving them lots of opportunities to interact.
And when you say opportunities to interact, Regina, what is that on a practical level for me? I don't understand what that means. What is that?
Absolutely. What we're specifically looking at are prompts from the teacher to engage directly with the curriculum. For example, when you're asking students to complete a problem and give the answer, you're asking students to raise their hand and tell you something. You want them to explain something, model something. Everyone do this problem and show me something that says that you're interacting with this. The opposite of that would be more of like a lecture type presentation.
Standing in front of the blackboard or the old-fashioned blackboard.
Or just talking.
Or just telling the kids, you go work on this and figure it out.
Yes.
Which we see a lot of, and all of our data says when teachers say, why don't you guys just figure it out, we get the highest rates of off-task and the highest rates of disruption.
So they need a little help.
They need a
little
little
prompting.
direction.
Prompting is the word you use,
Yes,
right?
the
Teaching.
prompting.
We're here with Regina Hirn and Terry Scott from the College of Education and Human Development at UofL. Terry, another thing that you sent me that I thought was interesting, you said minority students receive more negative statements from all teachers regardless of their behaviors. What does that mean?
Well, there's a lot of people writing about this, and so we wanted to pull it apart and see what was there in our data set. And what we found is, because we code when we do an observation, the ethnicity and the gender of the teachers and the students we're looking at, what we found is that knowing that a teacher is of a certain ethnicity or a certain gender is not a predictor for anything. There's pretty equal levels of teaching across everybody we see. When you look at students, however, what we find is that if we've coded a student as being a minority, they are far more likely to get negative interaction with the teacher. The teacher's far more likely to say something negative to them. And if you control for their behavior, we find that it still holds true. And it doesn't matter if the teacher was a male or a female, or if the teacher was a minority or a non-minority. Our minority kids get more negative interaction regardless of their behavior. And it's something that we really struggle to explain. there are a lot of ways we could talk about it, and some of it, quite frankly, is difficult to talk about.
Well, let's be frank. We've had some folks on the show who've talked about teachers and counselors trying to interact with kids using hip hop culture, something that black kids can relate to and understand. Is that the deal, that you've got white teachers, mainly white teachers, that just don't understand African American youth and culture? Is that a fair assessment or not?
I don't think that we have data that would support that. That could
Okay.
be the case.
Okay.
I think it's more likely that everybody is affected by the culture. And so if as human beings we see patterns and start to believe that those patterns are something that's going to happen again, whether you are black or white, you're just as likely to fall prey to those patterns. And so that might explain why we actually do see that minority kids have more problem behaviors. But even if we control for that, we see the same issues. But the reason why we likely see the difference in those behaviors is because our African American kids especially are overrepresented in poverty and are overrepresented in schools where teachers are less qualified. If you look across the board in the United States of America, if you're a kid from a disadvantaged background, you probably have teachers that are far less experienced than kids that are in more affluent areas. So all of this starts to play together, and which is most important, it's really hard to say.
Right, gotcha. All right. Laura, or I just wanted to call you Laura Hirn. I guess you hear that from time, like Laura Dern. Regina, what would you say to folks who say, if you've got a disruptive kid in the classroom, you should just send them down to the principal's office and deal with them that way. It's we've got to be more disciplined, and the teacher should just get them out of the classroom because they're disrupting other kids. Some kids you just can't deal with. You got to get them out of the classroom. What would you say to that person?
I would ask them to think about the student's behavior in terms of what do we need to teach them. Before we send them out of that room, let's really think about what is that skill deficit and how can we teach the behavior that we would like to see instead of removing them from the environment in which they're going to be hopefully successful academically. We really want teachers to keep their students in the classroom. And in our pre-service programs, we really encourage our teachers to use positive classroom supports, good classroom arrangements, good structure in their classroom to address as many potential problems as they can to try and prevent some of that disruptive behavior that might lead them out of the classroom.
Are there some kids that you just can't deal with, that they just need to go into an alternative school or spend half the day in the principal's office?
Yes, but it's a very small percentage. And what we find is if you show us a kid who has high levels of disruption, more likely than not, the teacher in that classroom is using extremely low rates of the things that we would like to see them use in order to prevent that. So we have zero evidence in the world that sending a kid out of the classroom will change their behavior. Sometimes kids' behavior is so dangerous or disruptive that they have to be removed. But prior to them being removed, as Regina was saying, we'd like to see that the teachers have used all the things that give us the best chance of them being successful. Teachers that use the lowest rates of engagement have kids that are, what's the, I'm trying to, 67% more likely to be disruptive. So if we know that teachers' behaviors create a probability for disruption, we also know that teacher behaviors can create a probability for not having disruption.
All right. So what are we teaching the kids at UofL? Regina, you already talked about it a little bit, but what are we teaching these new teachers that are going out into the world and teaching in JCPS? What are we telling them on the ground how to deal with those students?
The students, specifically in addressing challenging behaviors, we are really working with our pre-service teachers to help them understand the best ways to structure their environment, to teach the behaviors that they are looking for very explicitly in the classroom setting, and to definitely make connections and have positive interactions with their students. If we can really address those three things, we're really setting up a positive climate in that classroom environment.
And the education graduates and teaching graduates from the University of Louisville are learning this stuff and should be great teachers when they get out in the classroom and should be able to deal with this,
If
right?
you're in special ed at UofL, you're hearing this every day from us.
Yes, you are.
Okay, very good. All right, terrific. Terry Scott, thanks for coming back. Appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for
Regina,
inviting me.
Hirn, it's nice to meet you, and you're welcome back anytime to talk about this study as they move along, because it's really interesting stuff and, as you might suspect, a little controversial.